If you sign up for Social Security in 2026, there is a real chance the agency owes you money it never told you about. Not hypothetically, not as a scare tactic. A federal watchdog report just confirmed it, with names redacted but numbers intact. 8,618 widows and widowers underpaid by an average of $5,800 each. That is not a rounding error. That is rent. That is 6 months of groceries. And nobody at Social Security picked up the phone to tell them. Here is the part that should bother you more. The same agency that made this mistake also told Congress just last month that their average phone wait time is under 5 minutes, the best it has been in a decade. A Senate office called to check. The real number, measured by actual calls, was 102 minutes, 8.5 times longer. So if you are planning to call and ask, "Did you mess up my benefits?" you might want to sit down first, possibly for 2 hours. There is one step buried near the end of this video that fewer than half of Americans approaching retirement even know exists. It takes about 10 minutes. It is free. And depending on your situation, it could be worth tens of thousands of dollars over the rest of your life. We are getting there. But first, you need to understand why this keeps happening, because once you see the pattern, you will never trust a "we will notify you" promise from this agency again. This is not a video about Social Security being corrupt. It is not trying to make you angry at some faceless bureaucracy for sport. It is about something quieter and, honestly, more uncomfortable. A system that runs on human hands, processing hundreds of millions of records, where the job of catching mistakes has quietly shifted from them to you. Nobody announced that shift. It just happened, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with the widows. Picture a woman in her early 60s. Her husband passed away before he turned 62, so her survivor benefit could not be calculated automatically, the way most claims are. It had to go through what the Social Security Administration calls manual processing. A real person sitting at a desk, doing the math by hand, following a formula that determines how much she gets for the rest of her life. That manual step is exactly where the Inspector General's office found the problem. 8,618 people in this exact situation, shortchanged. Total damage, more than $50 million. The agency's own spokesperson confirmed it to reporters and said field office employees had been given a reminder about the correct procedure for calculating something called the widow's primary insurance amount. A reminder after thousands of people lost money for years. Now, here is the number that should really stop you. The Inspector General estimated that nearly 40% of surviving spouses reviewed during that period may have been affected by similar errors. Not 8,000. 40% of an entire reviewed population. Read that again if you need to. Almost 1 in 2.5. And notice what kind of error this is. It is not a server crash. It is not a glitch in some algorithm nobody understands. It is trained employees following a process, getting the same calculation wrong over and over across thousands of cases. That is actually scarier than a software bug because you cannot patch it with an update. The mistake is baked into how the work gets done. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. If close to 40% of a reviewed group had errors, what are the odds that your case or your mother's case or your neighbor's case was never reviewed at all? That question is going to follow you through the rest of this video, because the widow story, as bad as it is, turns out to be the smallest part of a much bigger picture. Zoom out from individual widows to the entire federal government, and the numbers stop being human-sized. In fiscal year 2025, federal agencies reported a combined total of $186 billion in improper payments across 64 different programs. That is $24 billion more than the year before. The trend is not improving, it is getting worse. Since 2003, when the government started seriously tracking this, the cumulative total of improper payments sits at roughly $3 trillion. $3 trillion is a number that stops meaning anything past a certain point. So let's bring it back down to Social Security specifically. Between 2015 and 2022, the agency paid out about $8.6 trillion in benefits. Of that, roughly $71.8 billion, just under 1%, was paid incorrectly. 1% sounds almost reassuring, doesn't it? 99% accuracy. But 1% of 8.6 trillion is still tens of billions of dollars moving the wrong direction. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. The Inspector General once found that Social Security failed to issue about $52 million in underpayments, money the agency owed people, to almost 28,000 individuals. Why? Because their internal alert system had a built-in blind spot. It simply did not flag underpayments over $2,500 in certain categories, or cases involving deceased beneficiaries without a surviving spouse on record. The agency agreed with the recommendation to fix it. They have not implemented it. Sit with that for a second. This is not a case of we didn't know. They knew, they said on paper, yes, this needs fixing, and the fix did not happen. That tells you something important about how these systems actually work. Knowing about a problem and prioritizing a fix are two completely different things, especially when the people affected are not the ones writing the agency's performance reviews. Most coverage of Social Security errors focuses on overpayments, the agency demanding money back from confused retirees. That story gets airtime because it is dramatic. Some gets a letter demanding repayment of $15,000 they did not know they owed. But underpayments, money the agency owes you and never sends, barely get mentioned. And that imbalance in coverage creates a dangerous assumption that if there's an error, it's probably not in your favor anyway, so why bother checking? The data says otherwise. There is real money sitting on the other side of that ledger too. Which brings us to a question that matters more than any of these numbers individually. If the agency already knows it has a backlog of unresolved internal warnings, how exactly are you supposed to find out if you're one of the people affected? You would think the answer is, they call you. Let's test that. This is where the agency's own numbers start fighting each other in public. In May of 2026, the Social Security Commissioner testified before Congress that the average wait time on the agency's 800 number had dropped below 5 minutes. He called it the best performance in a decade, an 89% improvement from a high of 42 minutes the year before. That is a genuinely impressive number, if it's accurate. A Senate office decided to check it for themselves, real calls, a real stopwatch, not relying on the agency's self-reported dashboard. The measured average wait time, 102 minutes, 8.5 times higher than what was being told to Congress. It gets worse before it gets better. Of the calls that were actually answered, 32% waited more than 2 hours. 1 in 10 callers waited more than 3 hours. And more than half of all calls placed were never answered by a human being at all. The call would sit on hold, then simply get dropped. So how do you get a 5-minute average and a 102-minute average out of the same phone system? Here is the mechanism, and it is worth understanding because you will see this trick used by other institutions too, not just this one. If a caller accepts a callback option instead of staying on hold, their wait time is officially recorded as 0 minutes, even if the callback doesn't arrive for 1 to 2 hours. Even if it never arrives at all, because uncompleted callbacks get canceled at the end of the business day instead of rolling over. Nothing about that is technically a lie. It is a definition, a very convenient one. And it produces a headline number that looks fantastic in a congressional hearing while bearing almost no resemblance to what a real person experiences holding a phone to their ear for 2 hours. There's one more layer here. A separate, nonpartisan watchdog organization noted that starting in May of 2026, the agency simply stopped publishing some of its other key performance metrics. How long people wait for appointments? How many requests are sitting unresolved in the processing backlog? Right around the time outside scrutiny was increasing. None of this means the people answering phones are doing a bad job, Most of them probably are doing their best inside a system stretched thin. But it does mean something important for you personally. You cannot fully trust a published average to tell you what your actual experience will be. And if you cannot trust the wait time number, you should not assume the accuracy numbers are airtight either. This is not about politics. It is about reading any number a large institution publishes about itself with a simple follow-up question. How exactly was that number defined? That skill will serve you well beyond Social Security, but it leaves you with a real problem. If you cannot count on a phone call to catch an error in your file, and you cannot fully trust the metrics telling you everything's fine, what's left? Self-checking. Which sounds obvious until you realize most people don't even know what they're supposed to be checking for. The next mistake is the one nobody calls you about, because as far as the system is concerned, there's nothing to call about. Let's talk about a woman we'll call the case that doesn't show up as an error at all, because technically nothing was miscalculated. She's 64, divorced after 22 years of marriage. She worked her whole life, but her income was consistently lower than her ex-husband's. When she filed for Social Security, she received benefits based on her own work record. That's it. Nobody flagged anything. No audit caught a mistake because there wasn't a calculation error. There was a knowledge gap, and the agency has no obligation to close it for you. Here's what she likely didn't know. If a marriage lasted 10 years or more, a divorced spouse can claim benefits based on their ex's earnings record, up to 50% of what the ex would receive at full retirement age. This has nothing to do with the divorce settlement. It does not reduce the ex-spouse's benefit by 1 cent, and the ex-spouse is never notified that the claim was made. It is by design completely invisible unless you go looking for it. A 2025 survey from a retirement research institute asked adults a simple true or false question. If you're divorced, you may be eligible for benefits based on your ex-spouse's record. 50% answered incorrectly. Half. The year before, in 2024, the wrong answer rate was even higher, at 53%. This isn't a knowledge gap that's closing over time. It's a knowledge gap holding steady year after year. It goes deeper than that. 30% of adults surveyed didn't even know Social Security offers any kind of spousal benefit at all, married or divorced. That's roughly 1 in 3 people missing the most basic version of this concept before you even get to the divorce-specific rules. Now think about why this particular gap exists. A lot of people here claim based on your ex-spouse's record and instinctively recoil. They don't want anything tied to a person they've moved on from. That reaction makes emotional sense. But it has nothing to do with the financial reality. There is no interaction required, no notification sent to your ex, no reduction in what they receive. It is a completely separate, legally independent claim that happens to be calculated using someone else's earnings history. The emotional hesitation and the financial decision are two unrelated things, and treating them as the same thing is costing people real money. Run the math for a second. If 50% of people answer this question wrong, and you're watching this video in the same age range this applies to, the odds say roughly 1 out of every 2 people watching right now might be in exactly this position. Not might know someone who is, might actually be that person. Knowing the benefit exists is step 1. It doesn't pay you anything by itself. The real question is how you find out if it applies to you without spending 2 hours on hold with a phone system we just proved doesn't tell the truth about its own wait times. Here's where this all comes together. And here's the part that was promised at the very beginning. Before you file for any Social Security benefit, not after, go to the agency's official online portal and create or log into your account. Pull up your earnings record. Compare it line by line against your own W-2 forms or tax returns, going back as far as you can. This matters because once you start receiving benefits, some of these errors become much harder to correct retroactively. Checking before you file beats checking after. If you find a discrepancy, or if you think you might qualify for a divorced spousal benefit based on what we just covered, don't start with a phone call. Based on everything we've seen about call center wait times today, an in-person appointment at a local office is very likely a faster path to a real human being who can actually look at your file. And if the first person you speak with says everything looks fine, ask specifically for a manual review. Not because they're trying to brush you off, but because the Inspector General's own findings showed the errors cluster in manually processed cases, exactly the kind that get missed on a quick first pass. None of this means Social Security is broken, and it doesn't mean the people working there are careless. It means something more specific. This is a system run by people, processing records for roughly 70 million Americans, and any system at that scale will produce errors. The current policy puts the burden of finding those errors on you, not on them. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how the incentives are currently built. And once you understand that, getting frustrated isn't really the useful response. Checking your own file is. So here's the question worth sitting with after this video ends. If an agency identifies its own mistake, agrees in writing that it needs fixing, and then leaves that fix unfinished for years, where does the responsibility actually sit? Is it the sheer size of the system, 70 million people, more cases than any team could individually verify? Or is it a quieter problem, a lack of real urgency to prioritize fixes for the people who have the least power to push back? There's no single right answer, but it's worth asking, especially before you assume no news from Social Security means no problem. If this changed how you're going to handle your own filing or your parents', send it to them. Not because this is shocking content for the sake of being shocking. Because 10 minutes of checking today could be the difference between getting what you're owed and quietly losing it for the next 20 years.